Okay, so I'm happy to call us to order. This is the June meeting of the Board Governance Committee. We have a couple of agenda items. Darren, if you could, it would be helpful to put that in the chat so the members can see it. We did send out the agenda. I don't know, earlier this week. Not so early this week. It's been a short week. But we'll put the agenda in the chat. I don't want to speak completely out of turn.
That wasn't working before. Okay, it should be up now.
All right, we're good. Okay, so we're checking in on our work plan progress. It's a couple of we're checking in on our work plan progress. As part of that, we want to talk about engagement and what that looks like, just like across committees and where we fit in. We want to update people on how the governance survey is doing. And I believe we will also, Darren, correct me if I'm wrong, be joined for a little bit by someone from the Office of Racial Equity.
Yes, Amber will be joining us at 4 o'clock.
Okay, Amber's going to join us at 4, so that will probably be toward the end of our agenda. And we want to check in on some of the board governance planning so we can continue to move that forward. Are there any questions about the agenda or anything that looks like it's just blatantly missing? Brett Patterson asked if the link could be resent to him.
Sure. Yeah, I'll send it over right now.
Thank you. All right, hearing none, I'm going to go ahead and get us started because we have enough stuff on the agenda. First, we'll pull up the work plan so everyone can see it. One of the items we wanted to talk about was a request from the board to do our best to try to align engagement. I know you all remember because you were part of making it happen. The engagement sessions we had as collective committees across committees last year in the fall, and we want to do the same thing this year in the fall. As I understand it, so far the optimal time identified is sometime in September, which might be a little bit earlier than we planned. I'll pull up our work plan, but everything doesn't have to be perfect. And I think the goal is really for us to compromise and come together. So I will stop talking for a second. Darren's put the link in the chat. If it's helpful for members, I can also share my screen. Just let me know. So first, are there any questions, and would it be helpful to share the screen, or are people good with the link?
I could share my screen.
Oh, thank you, Darren. Are there any questions about what I just said? No questions? Okay, any thoughts on September engagement?
Just
the question I would have on that is just, what are we going to have a set of proposals for people to respond to? That's, I think, what we had talked about having the engagement around.
So we're pulling up, Darren's pulling up the work plan. Our goal was to vote on draft recommendations. And I think we actually could have some draft recommendations by them. Our vote was to vote out of committee draft recommendations at the end of July. We also have just some built-in buffer, honestly, in the work plan. In June, there's in July and August. Yeah, because we said we didn't know if it was going to be July or August that we presented recommendations at the working session. We kind of assumed it would be August. So I don't foresee us not having recommendations by September. They actually would be pretty fresh in September.
Okay.
And we had, based on our work plan, we talked about a second round of community meetings, anticipating, again, the vote would be done. We were looking at October, I think. September and October. Yeah, we said September and October. So I think it's still doable. I don't know if it's, I guess, in my opinion, later in September is a little bit better because it gives you enough time to like people to get settled, be in school, you know, we can hit a couple back to school nights, that type of thing. But I think September is doable both for the work and then starting to socialize the outreach. What do others think?
I'm in the midst of transitioning my
No
device,
worries.
but that sounds right to me in terms of timeline.
And same to me, provided we have, you know, good draft recommendations in August and we can massage them in September. I agree with you. Late September is better than early. It gives us more time to do that, but we can swing it.
And I'm cool with it too. Works for me.
Okay. All right. So we will, so people know how this is working. The staff has kind of been the muscle behind the scenes, just kind of keeping everybody on task. It has been really the bridge to, you know, make the collaboration happen. So they will come back to us with some proposed dates and it looks like it'll be governance, literacy, and possibly family engagement. The overall family engagement from the Advocacy and Outreach Committee will be the 3 topics as I understand it right now. Okay, so let's keep it moving. I am going to actually turn it over to Darren because we do have some just preliminary highlights from how the survey is doing so far. And he has put together just some quick slides to make that easier to digest.
Yeah, let me share my screen. I'm going to just for now, I know that since the survey is still open, just going over some of the preliminary responses or response rates. So far, 224 people have clicked on the survey. Out of those 224, 147 completed the survey. So it's a 66% response rate so far. Not too bad. As a reminder, we had a goal of 2,000 people that are part of this. We also had demographic goals that I'll get into in a little bit. But as I mentioned, we have about 147 who completed the survey, and those are the responses that we're actually going to analyze. 41% indicated that they're DC parents, guardians, or relatives of DC. Oh, I'm sorry, not students. And 75% are affiliated with DCPS in some form or fashion. Either they have one or more children in DCPS, or they are a student attending a DCPS school. Just give me a moment. I think someone might have joined.
It's just me. I changed my device. Sorry about that.
Okay. 27% indicated that they belong to or are affiliated with a public charter school. Most respondents' children do not receive services, so about 70% of respondents. We have goals around hearing from more families or students that do receive services like IEPs, 504s, in English language services. So we certainly do want to boost those up. By ward, the top 3 wards so far are 20% of respondents come from or reside in Ward 4, followed by Ward 7 and Ward 3. The least number of people responding are wards from Ward 6, Ward 2, and Ward 8. Majority of the respondents have children in pre-K to 5, so about 90% of respondents. And then lastly, notably, nearly half are interested in learning more about the results of this survey. And so they provided their email. About 72 respondents provide their email. I'm going to share out just where we're at with the survey and asking them to share out the survey. Many of the respondents mentioned how they found out about the survey was through emails. And so hopefully having people share out the emails with each other. So that's where we're at with response rates and the breakdown. As far as the results, I've been looking through them and pulling just a few high-level themes based on each of the questions. But since it's still open, I think I'm going to hold off on publicly sharing those with everyone. But does anybody have any questions so far on this?
I mean, I guess we'll come back to how are we gonna get another 1,800 responses?
Yeah, great question, Ruth. So,
I mean,
so
we can
far,
do that at the end. I just didn't want to gloss over it.
no. And actually, that's a great segue. So let me just go into where we need to hear more from. We definitely need to hear more from families whose children receive services like IEPs, 504s, so on. We need many more families from wards 5, 7, and 8, as well as Title I schools in general. One of our goals is to hear from families that have their children or are attending schools in wards 5, 7, and 8. We also need more representation from respondents who identify as African American, Black, non-Hispanic. Hispanic, Latino is still, we have a few, but we still need to boost those as well. And then lastly, increasing our social media presence. So the state board has tweeted this out, but just asking, I know some of the state board members just like sending out a recommendation or sending out a reminder to retweet this survey out. But we've, in terms of your question, Ruth, like boosting those numbers, just the past few days have been really pushed, like doing very targeted emails to out of school time summer programs, LSATs, reaching out to the student advice, SAC representatives to share it out with members. So we're doing a lot of targeted emails now to boost both overall who's responding to the survey, as well as actually getting responses from like at the ward level and other demographics.
Darren, the only thing I will add to that, 2 things. One, we also have Darren said it nicely, and I'm just gonna make it an ask. I will include this in our report, our working session. Members need to share. We can kind of track who's been sharing and who hasn't. The majority of the members of the board have not shared the survey. That's first of all. Second of all, we have worked with our comm staff as of yesterday, I think, to do, I think that was yesterday. We started running actually Facebook ads and Instagram ads because we can target different zip codes. So we'll see that being able to boost. And I don't know if people, I'll repost Darren's agenda in the chat, but the next thing we're going to talk about is extending the survey. I know there's a couple of other ideas and requests around outreach, but I think those three are really important.
And one more thing to add to that, thank you, Ebony Rose. I'll be printing out the QR codes for that, like you could share out in your wards or like go to places where I guess seeking people who typically don't go on the internet, take surveys or anything like that. If you're in the communities, sharing out either a paper copy of the survey or sharing out a QR code. So going to places like laundromats, things like that. I know the goal is to get an overrepresentation of people who typically are underrepresented in taking these surveys, but and just hearing as many voices as possible across the district, especially those who don't typically take surveys. So I'll share those paper QR codes with everyone at the working session.
So I think it's really, can I jump in?
Sure.
I mean, I think it's really important for whatever reason, members don't seem that interested. That's an interesting question, but I think we need to really, I think, ask the staff to try to bring these QR codes out places. For example, what about 4th of July parades, 4th of July events? I mean, I think one of the problems at this point is, one way of normally getting responses, you can send it out to LSATs and you can send it out to school principals. That's not going to, and to the student advisory committee, that's not going to bring you a lot right now because folks aren't around. I think it's worth trying, but what about, going with the QR code to some of these big July 4th events and other big events?
Ebony Rose, I don't know if you wanted to answer that. Just my experience at the PAVE, like the recent PAVE event, a lot of people were very interested in it. It's a place where you could one-on-one talk with people about what the survey is, and they're just much more likely to take it. In fact, following that event, I checked the survey and several have already filled it out. I think that's a great idea, Ruth. And also I know that other events, like if you happen to be around like an out of school time, like summer program, if you happen to be at those, I feel like those, like maybe if parents are picking up students, something like that, if there's a place where they can see the QR code and you have a chance to talk with parents, I think the in-person human aspect of it will get a lot more voices. But that's my 2 cents. I'll let anybody else jump in there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to respond to the staff going to the 4th of July parade. That's probably not going to happen.
Oh, why not?
Not at this point, where they weren't, hey, we have a small but mighty staff, but also B, the 4th of July parade and the holiday is quickly approaching.
Yeah, no, I forgot it was just on Monday.
Yeah, and so I don't, from a human perspective, I would feel a little bit uncomfortable with making that request. Now, if members are going to parades and things like that, I mean, I do think it's an opportunity to share things out. I put my printouts to good use. I even printed some additional printouts when I went to the WTU rally. I got teachers to fill it out. I, talked with people at the PAVE thing. So I do think, I think the suggestion about being on the ground, identifying different events is a good one. And I think sharing that information is really important. One of the requests, and I know Rep. Wattenberg, you did this, was like, hey, let us know if you're going to any of your community meetings so we can tag along and we can get feedback. I will say that we did not see a bunch of members do that. And so if there are things that members are seeing, are going to, or maybe they can't go, but they would like someone else to go, just sharing that information is really important so we can get to as many places and as many people as possible.
also like to shout out Jacques for sharing this on his listserv as well. So just like there are many other avenues for getting this out, and following this in the minutes, I can also share out if anybody has any other ideas, maybe getting those out and just sharing as much as possible.
So two thoughts. One is I like the ads on Instagram and Facebook. I wonder about also the Washington Informer, and if there's some other local papers that we might look at. And the second is I totally take your point that July 4th is around the corner. I'd sort of forgotten that, and it's a holiday, but I do think we should, if it's a priority, and I think it is, that we should have as one of our tools this idea that staff can go out in the communities and do this with the QR codes, the way Empower Ed did with their surveys. I mean, it seems to me that's just something that should be part of what we do. And it would be so interesting for the staff to do it, and we could generate some real numbers with it. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, are you going to any of the parades, Representative Wattenberg?
I am, but I have like 5 things I'm doing at the parades. That's part of the issue.
Can we make this a 6th thing? I mean, look, I know we all
I
have
don't
a,
think so, but
I know
mean,
we all have a, I know we all have a bunch of things. I'm not saying it's a bad suggestion for staff to go out. I encourage staff to go out. I also want to be mindful that, you know, we hadn't planned for this earlier, and they probably have plans of their own, and we would have to pay them probably for the holiday and all these other things that it's not quite as simple as just to say, hey, staff.
No, that's why I'm saying I don't think it works for July 4th. I said that. I'm talking about on other days when it's not a holiday. Just that
Oh, okay. Yeah.
No,
I thought we were still talking about the parades on
No,
July.
I totally take your point. I hadn't realized how soon it was, and I totally take your point on that. So now I'm talking about more in the future.
Yes, future definitely noted and appreciated.
Also, another note, this is our first time using Facebook ads and Instagram ads. So this is sort of an experiment. So I'll follow up with you on how that goes and how many clicks we got from that.
So one thing, so Darren, when you say you'll send out the QR code, I mean, can it be sort of like a flyer, and then if we have volunteers at parades, people could just give them out?
Yes, so 2 things. In the email, the original email, and then the reminder email last week, I shared out 3 PDFs, each with the like a paper version of it that you can print out, but also the QR code and flyer for all of that for you all to print out. Next week's working session, since it will be in person, I'm also going to make enough copies to share, so you don't have to print all of those out. I'll have those ready to go for all the members to share out in their wards. I'll also share out another reminder email to members, especially around the areas where we need to build up and get as much representation from the district as possible.
All right.
And towards the end of this meeting as well, we'll be hearing from the Office of Racial Equity. So maybe they'll have some extra remarks. I've been working with them a bit on just, they've been really, really helpful in just getting ideas around meaningful community engagement. So these questions might also be answered by Amber when she joins at 4 p.m.
All right, anything else that would be helpful?
So I'm not finding the PDFs. Is it possible just either to resend them or to put them in the chat? So that we can just turn them into flyers and pass them out?
Not the chat, but I'll forward them in
Okay,
just a moment.
thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, wanted to give space in case delay of coming off mute or any of the Zoom things. All right, if there are no other questions or suggestions, I want to talk about extending the survey. Darren and I talked, and we are suggesting to extend the survey to what date, Darren? later in July sometime. I can't remember what though.
I believe we said the 29th. I have to jump back in my notes and look
End
at
of
that, but
July.
I believe it was the 29th. And by then we'll also be doing focus groups.
My my one new request is apparently we are now having a Ward 7 open streets. I don't know if all of my neighbors are excited because I already got some emails back from my newsletter about who approved this. But we will have a bunch of Ward 7 people out on the 30th of July. And so I'm planning to attend. So I would like their responses to be counted as well. I think that's a Saturday. I know it's a Saturday. I'm not crazy completely.
You know, another thing that maybe folks could follow up on is, you know, Alistair is running these readings in the parks. And that would again just be a place where there'll be some people and he could give out the QR codes and the flyer. You might be able to do that. And while that's not a target word, on the other hand, if we're looking for 1,800 responses, we really need everything. So
Maybe I could, following this, make suggestions. So like the easiest thing to do is retweet the SBOE QR code. That everybody goes on Twitter to look at these, but that would be like the easiest thing maybe. And then the like more involved things would be going out to the community and actually actively handing out the QR codes to like families or organization, like summer programs, something like that.
Okay, outside of my push for July 30th, selfish push for July 30th, are there any other requests to extend the survey further than that? We also want to balance just having enough time to take the feedback and distill it for the working session in August. That's the only constraint. I see a thinking face, but I don't hear any other pushes or
Is that a question of like when we should end it?
Mhm.
I mean, what we've done before is just kind of crunch the data in like 2 or 3 segments or 2 segments. And maybe that's what we could do so that we can still include folk from the event that you're referencing, which I would imagine would be a couple dozen at most that we would add to the number.
Yeah, well, it's a difference of a day. I'm asking us to go from the 29th to the 30th.
Yeah, like I don't think that's that big of a deal. And I guess what I'm saying is I don't even think we need to wait until the 30th to start identifying trends. But we can like set benchmarks to just kind of start making sense of the data while we have it.
Yeah, I think that helps make it more manageable. I guess, and I'm asking, did we need to go beyond the 30th? Like my push was saying, okay, can we go to the 30th? But is everybody good with that? Or were somebody going to come back and say, wait, August 5th or something? I don't know.
I'm good with that. I think we need to see where we are, but I'm good with that. And I think it's important to make that a goal and a target.
Okay. I didn't want to take silence as consent. All right. Darren, did we have anything else for next steps?
For next steps for this is for me to send out the reminder to members as well as to I'll ask Alex to share out reminders to community organizations. Those are the major next steps. I'll also update the end date of the survey.
Okay.
Or the close date, and I'm making it July 30th. Is that correct?
Yes, please.
Okay. Aside from that, I think that's the only thing I can think of. And again, just printing out those QR codes and sharing this out at the working session next week.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Moving on in the agenda, the next thing we have is talking about focus groups. So as of right now, and Darren will correct me if I'm wrong, we are planning 3 focus groups, I think. One that will serve with built-in translation. Nobody needs to request it for Spanish speakers, and the other 2 will be targeted toward English speakers. But of course, if people attended and needed translation, we would accommodate that. We wanted to talk about how we just kind of get a overview of what the focus group questions and length look like. Talk about how we're incorporating, taking the feedback and actually putting it into the recommendations, and then any next steps for that. If it's helpful, I'm also happy to re-add the items I just listed in the chat, because that's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, that's helpful.
And because I know it gets the scrolling up and down gets to be a bit much. All right, this is what I'm saying to you. So I just reposted it. Yeah, so we have not yet decided on the exact dates in July. Part of why we are having this conversation now is because we had to talk about just the costs associated with the contracting of the translation and other things. We have been in conversation, PAVE offered to host a focus group in some of the organizations. And of course, we are inviting all the respondents that have indicated interest. And then we'll do another blast about the focus groups in particular. So we have some kind of we have a built-in audience we have a built-in audience a bit. But one of the things we wanted to talk with the committee about is based on what we learned from the fall engagements. It really is kind of the same set of information. What we have to start thinking about, how do we translate what we receive into recommendations? And so I didn't know, I guess I want to know first, does it make sense to keep, in my mind, you keep the questions kind of the same because you want as many people to answer the same questions as possible. And we got pretty good feedback and ratings based on the fall engagement sessions. That was the highest rated session, and we had different types of different people with different levels of expertise. I'm going to just say my default would be we should largely keep the presentation the same, but I didn't want to assume, given we could have also learned some things since then. So I think that is the question and the thinking that we want some response to. Brett Wattenberg, is that a new hand?
Yeah, so I guess I'm concerned that we're still at a fairly general level. And if we want to use part of what we're finding as the basis of our recommendations, we need to get into this more. I mean, to what extent do people miss having a school board? I mean, that's something, do they want that? I want to know that. Do people feel that it's a concern that data that's handled by OSSI, that we don't have this check and balance between DCPS and OSSI? That doesn't exist anywhere else in the country. Is that a concern of people? Is it a concern that, and I guess this we sort of have in the existing survey, the repairs issue, who should be responsible for that? Anyway, I think there's a bunch of questions like that. Is it right for, do we have the right process for determining when to close schools and when to open them and where to open them?
I mean, I know that's something that, you know, New York City has mayoral control, but they still have local boards that handle that question. So I just think that there's some specific questions that, you know, come up when you talk to people in greater depth, and I think we want to hear people out a bit on that. So I would hope that we would raise some of that in these focus groups.
Are you hoping that we would raise it or that they will raise different issues? I think, and I ask because the way the work plan is designed, we are at the same level of detail because the hope is that we're not talking to the same people, we're now talking to new people. And so we want to give as many people, and I know like patience is not my virtue, I'm gonna be honest about it. And so it takes a lot of restraint on my part. But we want to be able to get a sense from as many people as possible, given we only were able to get responses from 50 people during the fall engagements. We haven't heard from a bunch of people at this level. So it really is designed to stay at this level through the first level of recommendations and then move to a different level.
Well, I mean, I'll just acknowledge that I'm worried that we're not going to get to a very, you know, to a point where we can start making recommendations. I mean, I think we have two roles. One is to hear people, but a second is to offer options to address the problems that have been raised. And if we're just delaying that. So I'm concerned about that. So that's all. I mean, you know.
What do you mean we're just delaying that? Say more.
Well, at some point, we need to address concerns. You know, and ask, you know, if there's a concern about responsiveness, say here, you know, here are ways that responsiveness can be addressed. In most of the country, people have school boards where you can go to. There are school boards where you bring things to, and those are the same people that make decisions. Is that helpful? You know, there are, you know, the council came up with a recommendation to separate, you know, to have OSSI be independent of the mayor in some form, is as a way of creating greater checks and balances. Is that something that people are sympathetic to? I'm just repeating myself, but
yeah, I guess the reason I asked you to say more about why we're delaying it is because we're not behind in our work plan. And the work plan really was designed to reach as many people as possible before we started to distill. So do you feel like in only having heard from 50 people with focus group responses, we should close that off and move to a different set of?
well, I think we're also hoping to talk to 2,000 people through a survey, and I think you can do both things. Anyway, I think I've made my point. When I've been involved in things like this, you start to put some ideas out there. So that's my recommendation, but you know, but I've made that point.
Okay. Does anyone else have thoughts or sorry, Darren?
I was gonna just quickly mention, this is a very, and I'd love to get all of your thoughts on this. This is a very technical side of things to ask people, like, how would you, who should be responsible for fixing facilities, things like that. Those are very technical questions. I'd like to know your thoughts on how we ask those questions. In my head, I was thinking of just taking those who were interested in the focus group, kind of looking at the responses they gave and others gave and probe more deeply. So when they say something like, my experience or my thoughts on improvements to the education governance system is more transparency or more communication, diving deeper into those questions and asking probing questions around what do you mean by that, and having these one-on-one questions rather than who should be fixing it. In my head, I figured
So
this is
who
a,
is going to take up those technical questions? I guess that's, at some point, I assume we want to have recommendations that go beyond, people are very concerned that repairs aren't done.
so,
So when do we get to that, or how do we get to that?
so in the recommendations, perhaps it would, like hearing from experts and hearing from like feedback from like those probing questions. From that, having another round of public engagement on the recommendations that kind of dive into, okay, these are going to be the folks who would do it based on what we hear from experts and the public. But I think the very technical questions might be challenging, and avoiding leading questions like, do you think like DGS, should they do like that might be a leading question, putting words in
Right,
like
that was not a good idea, but that's not a great example. But, I think you can ask people, what did it, a lot of people have experiences with school boards. What was good about it? What wasn't? What do they miss?
But even like the language, what do they miss implies like that's colored language that we
Ask
can't.
both sides of it. What do you miss and what do you appreciate? You can ask both.
I mean,
Anyway, I'm done.
is it possible to keep the survey the same and just add more questions for those that may want to go further, more in depth?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, yes. The answer is yes. That that really is the idea, to like get more in. So like it is super limiting to say, yeah, it is super limiting to say, to ask somebody a multiple choice question and say like, hey, which one of these are you concerned about? Right. And then they select some things, but I don't know why. I don't know how you got to that point. I don't know. So it is to like give that a qualitative layer for what the different things mean before we make the assumptions. Also, in the focus groups we had with the fall engagement, one of the things people appreciated was like we had some people who had like almost no familiarity with the governance structure, but they were still able to interact and say, here's what would make my life better, or here's what is already working for me. And we had people who were super well versed in technical, like we had a couple people who had been through the process of opening a school, who got into the nitty gritty of like OSCE and different departments. And so we were able to like have different types of interactions based on what the knowledge of the audience was. I don't want to assume, or I'll say this, my concern is I don't want us to assume that broader questions mean that we always get simple or not helpful answers. We actually have gotten really rich answers from broader questions. And no, we don't want to say like publicly, here's all the things we've heard, because I think that also colors the things you get back from people. But I guess I'm hoping for a little patience and probably maybe grace and faith that people, people have been engaging in a way that is, that's been helpful to them, and that they see themselves in the process and they've been able to raise issues that.
Yeah, all of that, I guess my vote would just be to keep the survey the same in part A, and optional part B, where we can go more in depth for those. If we have more questions, to Representative Wattenberg's point, if we were able to craft fair questions, but also the qualitative lens that you're talking about, understanding that everyone won't have that, but it will just provide a bit more context when we're kind of crunching the data. And my guess would be with people with short attention spans, everybody won't opt to taking a part B of the survey. So
that might be something. Yeah. I'm thinking, any other thoughts?
One other, you asked the question before, like, how do we make sense of it, of the data? I don't know how this works on the timeline aspect, but I know we invited experts, and I'm using air quotes, but real experts that weighed in at different points. And I would love to invite them back, perhaps with us, with staff, with those experts, to have like a live conversation around trends that we're noticing to make sense of it. I think that could be really powerful for the public to digest, but also for us to just have a very transparent discussion around what we're seeing in the data.
Would you suggest, so we do have it built into the work plan that once we start to have recommendations, that we have a panel at a public meeting? Do you think that's like the right avenue, or do you think it's something else?
Yeah, I wouldn't do it at a public meeting because I think it could get just a little too messy. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but I think public meetings very structured, formal, and
Yeah.
this we will want like a very informal dialogue back and forth. But it could be a committee meeting where we invite people, we give them packets of data, trends, and just ask folk like make sense of it using your perspective, your expertise, because I think that will help us make sense of the data versus our very limited view.
Okay. I think we have to look at how to do that. I hear that. I'm now, my wheels are turning on what that would look like in the how.
Yeah, my vote would just be a committee meeting, inviting folk back, and we just digest the data.
Okay.
Yeah.
This probably is a good time to give a quick commercial before Amber comes. So I know that we asked if there were other experts we should hear from. We got names, but we didn't get contact info. And while I am always willing to track someone down if necessary, if you have submitted people and you have contact info for them, or a way for us to send them our way, because we're hoping that for our next committee meeting, we can hear from them and to be able to incorporate that feedback into the recommendations. So. Thanks, Alex. All right, so that's my quick plug. If not, we can't invite people that we don't know. Or we can try, but we might not be as successful. I'm trying to be successful.
Can I ask a question?
Yes,
It's not even about that. It was going back to that panel. Right now, do we have an idea of what that panel will look like? Or is it kind of just open-ended?
We're still open to suggestions. So far, I know Brett Wattenberg had a couple of names, but we didn't have the contact info, so we hadn't made any decisions about who. We just had like the names, and so if there are suggestions, I think what would be most helpful is name a little bit of information around like what they would cover, so we can curate, and of course contact info. And
remind me what month did we have that panel slated?
Well, we were hoping to do that this month, but
okay.
I didn't get any contact info, and I was busy. Darren was busy. We were tracking people down about other stuff, and so we're hoping to, like, I'm asking for it like right now, because we're hoping to do it at our next committee meeting.
Got it. Okay.
Because the goal is to get the information in to the recommendations, the first set of recommendations to draft.
Yes. That was going to be I don't know who Representative Weidenberg recommended, but it could be powerful if we are distilling what we hear from the survey and the feedback to also hear from stakeholders. I'm thinking from like other jurisdictions, and I know that makes some people, particularly in OSCE, uncomfortable, but I thought it was really powerful to hear from stakeholders from across the country. And I think it could be really powerful for us to look at jurisdictions that have variations of mayoral control or used to use that also as part of our deliberation process as we're coming up with recommendations. So I will huddle offline with Representative Weidenberg to see what name she recommended and then provide some others.
Okay, that sounds perfect. All right, I see info coming into the chat, so I am appreciative. Okay, so I'm gonna keep us moving along. Amber should be joining us in about 5 minutes. So Darren, is there anything else we did not cover before Amber joins? I was trying to move us along so we can get to her.
Let me check. Just give me one quick moment. I know it's I think the only thing I was going to mention was for next steps for the focus group. Putting together something similar to the survey, just putting together a draft, asking the committee to review that, followed by, and this is maybe a step that I overlooked for the survey, but also sharing that with OSCE and with other organizations who will be share or who help share out these surveys, but also just maybe getting their feedback on the focus group questions. What are your thoughts on that? If that's a step that you feel should be built into that, or agree that that should be built into that? Oh, Ebony Rose, I think you're on mute.
Oh, sorry, I was saying to sharing with the committee members.
Following committee members and finalizing the survey on the state board level, then sharing it with OSCE for their review.
So we will share with OSCE so they're not surprised. I think review is I think of it more as FYI for your information than review. That's how we've handled it previously. It's like, hey, don't be surprised or alarmed, other agencies. If you see your name in this thing, we just want you to know, especially in case you get questions, right? But it is not for, because review implies that there's recommendations back that we possibly might accept. So yeah.
The other next step,
yes.
The other next step is also I'm working with Roma on putting in a bid for a Spanish translator for the Spanish focus group, but also identifying Spanish-speaking participants for this. And I'll be working on this, but also I might reach out to all of you to also identify people who might be interested in participating in the focus group. Especially those that don't normally provide testimony to council or to the state board, just people who might not have their voices heard very often in education governance.
Yeah, I would add to that, if there are like community-based organizations that you know of that are, thank you, Rep. Patterson, that are serve non-native English speakers, and we can partner with them to identify participants, that tends to be helpful. We're not going to assume we are the end all be all of knowledge. Like I feel like there's some people some orgs we always tap, but we want to make sure that we are broadening the tent instead of just going to the same places. So that'll be my only add around that. All right. Well, we have 2 minutes until our speaker comes. Is there anything else that we did not cover, or any thoughts? All hearts and minds clear before we move on to Amber? I think that's a ghost hand, Representative Wattenberg. I'm gonna assume so.
I think
Wait,
so.
what's a ghost town?
Ghost hand, legacy hand.
Meaning your hand is up.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Sorry.
Maybe another thing I could throw out there while I know Amber's in meetings today, so she said she'll be ready at 4 p.m. So while we're waiting for Amber, just another thing, and I like what Zachary said a while back of just this process of getting meaningful community engagement. I've also been building out community organizations and their contacts, and just this process of setting goals and setting steps to get as much meaningful community engagement. I plan on just really reflecting on this process and sharing it with members for future surveys or future community engagement. And so I'm certainly taking note of all these steps and just best practices around these things.
Thank you, Darren. And thank you for just all the things you're doing to keep us organized and keep our work moving forward.
Yeah, of course. I have not heard back from Amber just yet. I'm gonna go on mute and just send a quick reminder
Okay.
and send out the link. So I'll be right back.
Oh, Amber's here. She just needs to be promoted. Excellent use of the chat, Amber.
Hi, Amber.
How are you? Welcome. No pressure. I know we were like, we're waiting for you, but we're absolutely thrilled that you could join us. I know Darren reached out just to talk a little bit about, the outreach, and then like, of course, like the distillation and interpretation and how we can be true to just lifting up, like being representatives, like how do we go best? How do we apply equity lens to our charge to be representatives in this process? So I will turn it over to you.
Great. I guess that comment in the chat isn't to me, but thanks for having me, Amber Hewitt. I'm Director of the Mayor's Office of Racial Equity and Chief Equity Officer for DC government. And I've had a few conversations with Darren about the equity audit tool. And I believe through that conversation, me and my colleagues shared a resource guide on meaningful community engagement. It isn't public on our website yet, but I believe we did share it with you all since it's finalized, but we're still working on a communication strategy. So Darren, if you haven't shared it with this group here, feel free to do so, but if you could keep a close hold because it isn't public to, I guess, the masses yet. So Darren asked me to talk a little bit about community engagement and applying an equity lens to community engagement. So I do have a few slides that I can show. And also what's not in here is sort of our overall scope and mission around racial equity and our definition. But I'm happy to answer any questions about that. But what I will say is that we see racial equity and meaningful community engagement is going hand in hand, and how racial equity is both a process and an outcome, meaning that, we're all striving for race and ethnicity to not be a predictor of opportunities, outcomes, or the distribution of resources, but also recognizing that racial equity is also a process of really meaningfully involving those who are most impacted into government decision-making processes. And I'm trying to pull up my slides. Give me one second. And I can also share these slides with you after. Some of them I'll leave for your reference. And Darren, you said about 10 minutes. So I'm sure you
Yeah,
got it. Okay.
that 10, 15 minutes, that'd be
So I'll aim to end by like 4:15. And again, I may skip some of the slides and I can just share the slides with you. So we define meaningful community engagement as a two-way process that really proactively seeks to prioritize the lived experiences, values, and concerns of residents, and as a way to establish an ongoing partnership with residents. And we also have particular principles and phases of meaningful community engagement that we'll talk about on the forthcoming slides. And we acknowledge that for engagement to be meaningful, it must endorse, prioritize, and practice power sharing and decision-making in Black and Brown communities, and also recognizing how those elements, that there have been some missteps by government and other actors in prioritizing the lived experiences of Black and Brown communities. So the resource guide that either you've seen or Darren can share with you, and I know State Board of Education, you all are independent body, but our initial goal was to design it for district agencies as they seek input on regulations and policies and programs, and serve as a resource guide to think through specific principles of equity-focused community engagement, as well as different phases. And it also includes a checklist. So once you see it, it's about 30 or so pages, but we also include a checklist that can be a good go-to reference. And I can also put our website in the chat box as well once I come out of the screen. You can see other tools that we have. We share it with Darren, our racial equity impact analysis. And this is a tool that agencies, organizations can use as they're developing policies and programs to ensure that you are thinking about unintended burdens or consequences of a proposal, that you're looking at data disaggregated by race and ethnicity. So just letting you know, this is one of many tools and resources that we've developed over the course of the year. So I was appointed in this role in April of last year. So we're a fairly new office, and I'm also new to district government. This is my first role in district government. So we have a table of contents that's included in the resource guide on community engagement. And I am going to spend more of my time on the principles and the stages, but just letting you know, we provide a definition of racial equity, which I highlighted before as being both a process and an outcome. In the guide, we talk about how historically, how community engagement has developed and matured from the government perspective, missteps, things that have worked well in district government. We give some examples of what has worked well. And also some pain points that we've heard from residents about how district government can strengthen our community engagement. And then it also includes that checklist, as I said before, and I will touch on briefly some of the common benefits and challenges to meaningful community engagement. So here are the principles, and this is one of, I think, one of the key slides in this presentation, because I think understanding these principles will help us be more effective as we plan for engagement when we're in the engagement with community, and then what our post-engagement analysis could look like. And I think it starts with being clear about who we want to engage and why. And I know sometimes, depending on different reporting requirements, that we have to be time limited in our engagement. And sometimes we may have a draft plan or a draft of something for community to react to, but being clear that we're seeking input on this particular tool versus something that will be on the further end of the spectrum of engagement would be to co-develop and co-design a policy program or tool with community. So I think being very clear and transparent about the purpose of the engagement is critical, because we know there can be a range. It could be, we're informing you about something. We are want to get your input on something, to all the way on the other end. We want to co-develop and design this policy program or initiative with you. The second principle is around understanding racial and historical trauma. What has occurred within that community that may serve as a barrier for community, for sort of receiving the input that you want on that particular initiative. But with that, who are the trusted community messengers that you could leverage? Do you have those relationships with community-based organizations that have deeper ties to community, even in light of racial and historical trauma that still may be on the hearts and minds of residents in particular communities? The third principle is on prioritizing trust, and I'll go into more detail on that on the next slide. The fourth is making information and engagement accessible. So thinking about language access, other types of access and compliance, things of that nature. The fourth is decision-making is transparent and accountable. And I think that ties up into the first principle about being clear on the intent of the engagement and how will feedback be incorporated. And also going back to community or communicating back to community or residents how their input will be reflected in whatever the outcome is. Next, being aware of positional power and power sharing, like what it means for district government or a government body to go into community and how what impact that may have on power dynamics, who is presenting the information, thinking about diversity of speakers or presenters when we're in community, the actual positions of those folks and how that may play into trust or the input that's received. And then meaningful community engagement should be deep and long lasting. So building a consistent and inclusive community presence and also engaging with cultural humility and respect. And I think part of that is built upon understanding the history of that community, understanding that racial and historical trauma, and not always putting the onus on residents to tell us what that is. What can we do? What research can we do? What tools or information or data that we have that could help us better engage residents with cultural humility and respect. So once you see the guide for each of these principles, we have a deeper dive into each of those where we talk about what the principle is and why it's important, tips on how to do it, as well as additional resources. So I just use prioritizing trust as an example. And I love the first point where it says authentic community engagement moves at the speed of trust. And trust takes time and energy to build. So we give some tips on how to do that, as well as additional resources and different toolkits based on each of those sample principles. You'll also see in the guide, we have recommendations or questions to consider for the 4 phases of meaningful community engagement. So how to prepare for it, the actual design, the how when you're actually engaging residents, the implementation, and then the evaluation component. And I won't go into detail for all of these, but just letting you know, we have steps and questions to consider for each of those 4 phases. And I'll talk about the preparation phase just for one example. So we have sample questions to consider. So what is the proposal? What is it in response to? Sometimes that's really helpful to sort of contextualize why we are going out and seeking input or surveying residents. What is this in response to? How will it be used? And what are some reasons that we want, community might want to engage on this issue? And then we also include some actions to consider. So develop an elevator pitch, something very digestible that really describes the intent of the intent of that engagement. So we have that for all of those 4 phases, and I'll leave that for your reference. But I would like to talk briefly about some of the benefits and challenges. And this is just an excerpt from the full guide. So we talk about how it promotes legitimacy and increased support for project and plans, build stronger relationships between BIPOC communities and government institutions, as well as increase the district's government's problem-solving capacity. And I want to zoom in on the point on that row where we talk about, we live in a city of local experts. We sometimes in our work call our residents citizen experts, because we know that communities that are closest to a policy problem are also closest to the policy solutions. How are we incorporating those perspectives in how we come up with solutions to the challenges that we face? And again, we also know that there are some challenges, and I know that you all as a body are tackling that right now, are thinking through how to address some of those challenges. So how to attract and maintain and sustain interest. We know residents are surveyed and are engaged a lot. I know we're thinking about that because we're going through a public engagement process with residents as we develop the first citywide racial equity action plan. Other challenges, how do you maximize participation? So again, having opportunities for engagement on the evenings or weekends, and could there be incentives? Could we provide childcare, making sure their language accessibility and other aspects of accessibility are addressed, are some other challenges. And for each of those challenges, we have strategies on how to mitigate those. And I know I'm close to time. We have a checklist that corresponds to each of those phases and incorporate some of those principles that I just mentioned. So I will pause there to see if there are any comments or reactions or just other questions about the office. We're a fairly new office, so I could talk about other initiatives or whatever is helpful to the group here.
Thank you for joining us. Does anyone have questions? I always have questions, but does anyone have questions? Well, hearing none, and I'll wait till if someone raises their hand, but I'm curious, since I know you all are a new office, and I know Darren has a question, but I know you are a new office. How, I don't know how to ask this, but what is it like working with other offices, adding this racial equity lens, which is very needed, I guess, in DC government? Like, could you just, I'm assuming you haven't gotten to the level of best practices, but anything that's promising or.
Yeah, well, our office is new. However, racial equity as a practice in government isn't new. So I've had the benefit of sort of learning from other jurisdictions who have carried out this work. I would say like Seattle and Portland and Chicago, Austin, Texas. Those are some jurisdictions that I some of my go-to references. And the reason why I had to join at the end is because we do three-hour trainings for district government staff once or twice a month, where we talk about our racial equity framework. How are we defining it? What's our vision? What's our theory? Like, we have a theory of change. We have a racial equity tool methodology. We've partnered with the Office of Budget and Performance Management, and this was the first year where agencies in their FY23 budget formulation were required to answer questions about how their budget is advancing racial equity. So I would say we do have best practices, but we're in the normalized build capacity part of our theory of change. So that's one way, through trainings, through the tools that we've developed. We have office hours for agencies. And I would say our citywide action plan that we're developing, I would hope that kind of puts it in clearer vision for district government staff on what we're actually doing and what are some government actions and this sort of first iteration of our racial equity journey that we could tackle.
Thank you, Darren.
Yeah, thank you so much. I heard a few good questions earlier in this meeting, and just some of them relate to how to capture voices in things like recommendations coming out of community feedback from things like our surveys, from focus groups, as well as after writing recommendations and sharing drafts publicly, how to equitably capture feedback from the community.
And let me know if this isn't answering your question. I can say how we're approaching it. And we're trying to get feedback through multiple avenues. So in person through public engagement forums, and this is for our racial equity action plan. So in person through public engagement forums, we're partnering with the Mayor's Office of Community Affairs and having language specific or constituent specific engagement forums to really target that language accessibility, making sure that we have a phone line for older adults who may want to, verbally share their information, and then also having a public comment period as well. So we're trying to make sure we're approaching it from different ways, and also balancing what we hear also with what's feasible, but being transparent around, okay, this is what we were able to take into consideration. This is maybe something for phase 2, that may not be appropriate to tackle now, but this is also what we heard. And I think the main point that I'll often think about is just affirming and validating perspectives, even if we can't act on everything, but having a posture of affirming the perspectives of residents. So Darren, I don't know if that answered your question.
I think so. Yeah. Let me just, if I could repeat that back to you. So in analyzing the work, it's both being transparent about the themes and what we heard and how we incorporated it into the recommendations. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And even on the front end, before you solicit that input, like what the goal of that, what the goal is and how it will be used. So kind of doing that at the beginning and the end.
And another question that came up during this meeting especially is this committee's work especially is highly technical. And so both public outreach and getting feedback on very technical issues like education governance and how to, I guess, I'm trying to form this into a question of like drawing a line at like what types of feedback you can get on highly technical subjects, I guess.
Yeah.
Just a reminder, I think I mentioned this earlier when we last met, but the two main questions for this survey and focus groups is what are people's experiences with education governance and what are things that they would like to see changed about education governance. But there's a lot to unpack there because a lot goes into education governance. It's students' experiences at the school, teacher retention, facilities and fixed, like how quickly facilities are fixed or how the turnaround times for communication about COVID. There's so many different things. So it's both technical and multifaceted. How do you engage with the community, get helpful feedback from the community on a very technical and nuanced area of education?
Yeah, and one thing that I did mention that I'm pretty sure we have in the guide is around avoiding jargon as much as possible and using plain language. So when you said education governance, and then you gave examples, like I would say, think those examples like school retention, how students experience schools, like those are, I can touch that, I can feel that. So I think that's something else to consider. We try to have all of our materials like an 8th grade reading level. I'm sure we don't always meet that, but also thinking about how we communicate. How can we ask the question in a way that's digestible and can be understood by a broad audience that doesn't forsake the spirit of the work? And I do think that kind of takes some, that's a process. I know we had to think hard through that and and we're going to be thinking through that, over the next couple of months when we do our summer engagement. And I think like defining the terms, like when we go into our engagement forms, we aren't just going to start with, oh, how can we advance racial equity in the district? No. Like, what is racial equity? How do we define it? Put it in plain language, and then sort of build prompts off of that.
Sometimes it's harder to put things in plain language, right, than the default to the jargon.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm
I
very
appreciate
guilty of that.
it's a struggle. It's a struggle for me. So I'm naming my struggle after those things. Does anybody else have questions? I know we're at like 4:24. Or comments? I see a no, but thank you in the chat. I see another thank you. And also, Darren was kind enough to push to the top of our inboxes all of the resources that were mentioned. So if people have, like we all have so much free time, but if people want to take some time to revisit that, that would be helpful. Brett Wattenberg, is this a question? Hold on.
No, so I just put in a question about how we could talk about the issues in language that's not jargony. And again, I'm just focused on this one at the moment, but you can ask people whether they think there should be a school board member to represent them as school policies are made, or it's good to have the mayor do it. I mean, that's part of what's at issue. But we could also break it down and ask, on particular questions, who should be making this decision? Should it be you making it at the school level with other parents? Should your principal make it? Should the mayor make it? Should the DCPS chancellor make it? Should the city council make it? Should there be a school board, a state board? That's part of what I'd like to get to, on key policy issues. Who should be making this decision? I mean, do they feel like they're part of it? And who should be making it? So I'm just throwing that in there.
And I'd like to throw out, just looking over the results so far, many people are not familiar with the roles of those organizations.
Correct.
Like, just looking at it, some of them are very, I don't want to like put anything out there just yet, because there are others there are people who haven't taken the survey yet, but things, I guess it's safe to say, like OSSI was one that a lot of DCPS parents responded to the survey, so they all were like, yeah, we're familiar with DCPS and their role in this. But other than that, like there's a lot of unfamiliarity with like what the council does. And so and maybe this is a question for you all, is just by asking, do you think the council should take ownership of X, Y, and Z? If they're not familiar with it, how do you do it in a way where it's A, not a yes or no question, and B, not a leading question of like,
Yeah,
or like avoid like the leading question of just like, should it be just general of just, how do you improve this, and then kind of go deeper and deeper and deeper into why do you think this, or how do you think about this?
yeah. I mean, we're at 4:28, and so I would offer that I do think one thing that will be just instructive is where we find the places that people are saying, I'm not familiar with this office, or I'm never in contact with this office, or I don't know what their responsibilities are, as a way of having, like, to me, that's actually a pain point, right? Like if we know, and then figuring out how to when we start to go the level deeper, like how do we then interpret that and simplify it in a way that is, to me, it's kind of an accessibility question, because I really appreciate the framing of people are experts like in their own lives. It's not that they don't know what they want to experience. That doesn't mean they can tell you, I want the council or I want the mayor. There are people who I know I've been in conversation with who the concept of mayoral control, despite the fact that they may have lived in DC their entire lives, was foreign to them. They did not know the mayor was the head of our education system. And so I'm looking forward to that. I'm sure we'll remain in conversation with the Office of Racial Equity. You all have been a phenomenal resource and partner to us. And as we wait for, get that, listen to that feedback, I'm sure we'll continue to lean on you for how do we, just stay on this path together. So I want to thank you for your time. I want to make sure I'm going to try to be respectful of everybody's time because we're now approaching 4:30. I don't know if there were any like final words that you have for us. Yeah.
No, just thank you for having me. And I will say, like, when we engage communities and as the agencies that we're working with who are deeper in this work, we told, one of the things that we said to share is what your agency does and not assuming that, residents understand even different positions and authority and things like that. So I think we're saying the same thing there.
Awesome. Thank you again.
Thank you.
All right, so we are at the very end of our agenda. If there is nothing else that we just completely failed to address, I'm gonna say I'm at least comfortable with adjourning. Any opposed?
I'm in favor.
All right, so at 4:30, we're gonna go ahead and conclude our meeting. I don't know if people are starting their weekend now, but I wish you a wonderful 4th holiday. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, thanks.
Bye.